Hi, I'm Don Warren, the host of Real Estate Power Zone, where we talk about a variety of topics that are helpful to real estate agents. To get access to all of the Zooms, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Real Estate Power Zone, and be sure to like and comment on this video as well as others. Today's topic is how to be successful selling properties in flood zones, and there's nobody better to talk about that than the flood guru, the flood insurance guru, Chris Greene. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let us know what you know.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. If it'll let's see, perfect. All right, let's see, you can see that. It looks like you can see it all right. Let's see from the beginning. All right, as I said, my name's Chris Greene. Today we're going to talk a little bit about selling properties in flood zones. To kind of give you a little background on myself, I hold a master's degree in emergency management with a focus in flood and hazard mitigation. So the day I started my master's was actually the day Hurricane Katrina hit. But that's really not what got me into this flood game. What got me into this flood game is I actually bought a property in a flood zone and had a terrible experience with it back in 2012. I got it about 2 weeks before closing, and the lender says to me, "Hey, your flood insurance is going to be $3,000 a year. Your DTI is going to be too high. It's not going to work out." And I was able to show them through some different guidance with the National Flood Insurance Program how this property was grandfathered into a special rate and how it was built into a different flood zone. So we took a $3,000 rate, we turned it into a $300 rate, and we got the house. But it was at that time, too, I discovered the lack of education with the insurance company even I was working with on flood, even the mortgage company, even the real estate company. It was at this time that I discovered this major gap in education. And so for the last 15 years, I've been helping people close that gap in education, get the flood insurance they need, and when properties do flood, making sure that financially they can recover. And so I'm going to go through today and I'm going to talk a little bit about selling properties. We're really going to talk about 6 things. We're going to talk about flood zones, flood maps, insurance costs, flood insurance options, elevation certificates, and even overall flood risks. So the goal is that when we cover these things today, you can go not necessarily advise your customer on insurance. You want to always rely on an insurance agent for this, but you want to know, hey, what's going to happen to my buyer when they buy this? Maybe they go invest and they're going to flip this property. Is something going to stop them from flipping it? Hey, is this property going to take a lot more time and effort to sell than I thought it was? We just want to make sure that you've got the information you need on the front end and your consumers have the same thing so they can create an awesome experience when it comes to working with you. And now you can have this knowledge and maybe you're selling properties in areas that other people aren't because they're afraid because they don't have the right information. So that's the goal of helping you today with these 6 things. So let's talk about flood zones first. Flood zones kind of scare everybody. Today we're going to talk about, how to find flood zones. We're going to talk about what's called non-special and special. So as a real estate agent, if you're in Tennessee and you're in other states, areas outside the coast, when you see a flood zone that says A, anything that begins with A, and a mortgage is related to it, it means flood insurance is going to be required. If you see anything with an X, it means flood insurance is not going to be required. It doesn't mean there's not a risk there. It just means from a regulatory standpoint, flood insurance is not going to be required. So just think non-special X, special A. So that when you're looking at a flood map, which we'll show you in just a second, you kind of know, hey, this property is going to require flood insurance. Let me go ahead and see maybe if the current property owner has a flood insurance policy in place. Because if they do, we'll talk about later in this presentation about flood insurance options, about some of the benefits of that being in place that can help you, help the buyer, help the seller, and everything. So when it comes to those flood zones, that's really what you want to think about, non-special and special. Special is going to require flood insurance if there's a mortgage. Now, if there's no mortgage, you remember, flood insurance is generally not going to be required at all unless it's FEMA, some kind of disaster assistance situation. So how do flood zones impact investor improvements? Now, this is a big thing that we work with a lot of investors with. We find that many investors pay cash. They don't check the flood zones on the property before they buy it. They go to buy it and maybe they make an addition. Maybe they improve the property more than 50%, which would be a substantially improved property. Well, what happens is when this happens, let's say a house was built in 1950 and they substantially improve it. That house now, according to the National Flood Insurance Program and their guidelines, says the house is built in 2023. That means that the base flood elevation, which is the level that flooding they think could come to, is completely different. This means they might have to fill in a basement. This means they may have to elevate a property, which could cost $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 because of the improvements they're making. And what happens is many times they have liens put on these properties and they can't get permits until these things are done. And they had no idea about these things when they bought the property. So it's one thing we really try to coach and teach investors on of, hey, check the flood zones on these properties before buying them, because here are the problems that could cause you. Here's the impact it could have on your profitability. So those are what substantially improved properties are. Same thing goes for substantially damaged. So maybe an investor decides to buy some of these properties from Hurricane Ian in Florida that were substantially damaged. That means basically 50% or more of the property's value was destroyed by the hurricane or the flood or whatever. Have the same rules here. And so we really try to help these investors really avoid these kind of properties, and by asking the right questions like, look, are you going to be looking at making additions? Are you doing cosmetic? Different things like this, just because we have to be very cautious there, especially in Tennessee with all the flooding that's happened over the last couple of years up in Waverly and Nashville. There's a lot of investors coming in and just buying these properties that are going into foreclosure, not knowing all these different things. And these things may not happen overnight. It may could take them 6 months for the local guidelines to actually hit. And by then it may be too late for them. So this is something we try to help real estate agents and even loan officers monitor these things on the front end. Now, could you be in the wrong flood zone? Yes. There is a big cost to being in the wrong flood zone. We help people with flood zone changes every day. What happens is when a lender pulls what's called a standard flood zone determination, tells you whether flood insurance is going to be required or not. But what happens is if you're in that wrong flood zone, let's just say flood insurance is required, but it really shouldn't be. It could have a 10 to 20% impact on the property value of you trying to sell that property. So it's really important that you understand, am I in the right flood zone? Could I potentially change my flood zone from a special flood zone area to a non? That's something we help people with every day, especially when people are building houses. Of course, they're going to be in that flood zone while they're building it, but hey, how do I build it out of this flood zone so that when the structure is complete, I can have it removed? It does a few things. First of all, it lowers the flood risk for the customer because the way we're having them elevate the property. It lowers overall flood insurance premiums long-term, and it helps increase property value because flood insurance is no longer required. As I mentioned, can we change a flood zone? Yes, this is something called a letter of map amendment. You may find it on FEMA's website called a LOMA. We're going to show you in just a second where to find these. So maybe a property owner says, yeah, I was in this required area, but a few years ago I did a flood zone change. I don't maybe have the documentation. The good news is that FEMA's website will always have the documentation of when the flood zone was changed. Maybe it was changed back again. We see that happen a lot when a flood map changes, where it has to be revalidated. And things that generally are needed to do this flood zone are going to be things like an elevation certificate, a tax plot, a deed. There's a couple other things on our part that we have to get, but the first step is really having a surveyor do an elevation certificate to see if you qualify. One of the easiest ways to really see if you qualify is the lowest adjacent grade on that elevation certificate needs to be above the base flood elevation by about 6 inches. So how do you read a flood map? If you're a real estate agent, and you're like, hey, I just got to know if flood insurance is going to be required in this thing. What we tell people is when we're looking at the FEMA website and you put an address in, if it shows in the blue, that means flood insurance is going to be required. If it shows in other areas, it's not going to be required. Now, in this particular image, you don't see a shaded area, but if you saw like some red lines through here, it means that you're in a regulatory floodway. This means that flood insurance could be actually significantly higher than just being in the regular required area. It means you may not be able to build in those areas depending on local guidelines. So you always want to try to avoid floodways if you can. Now, there are going to be properties that were built in flood zones 50 years ago that you can't do a thing about. But when you get those generally are going to have higher flood insurance costs because basically what it is it's the overflow area of whatever the flood source is. So when you're finding these changes for the flood maps, in the right-hand corner, you can always take a picture of our QR code that we have up there that will take you to the Learning Center to help walk you through some of these things. But this is the FEMA website for the map service. So you can put the address in here, and the right-hand side, when you put the address, it's going to show you a picture on the right. It's going to have a pin drop where the address is, and it's going to kind of tell you, you know, hey, if it's in the floodway, like you see right here on my right-hand side, that shaded area, or if it's just in the blue, or if it's in the brown, what's not required, then you can kind of know, hey, what flood zone should I list on this listing? It's also one of the reasons why we put a flood risk tool on our website to tell you if flood insurance is going to be required, and you get it immediately, because tax records are not always exactly accurate. Could be that a flood zone changed a few days ago that maybe tax records haven't caught up to. We see that happen all the time. Or what happens is someone puts in an old listing what a flood zone was a year ago, but the flood zone's changed since then, and what they put the wrong flood zone in there, and then they expose themselves to E&O claim. So what are the real costs when it comes to flood insurance? You know, when we're talking about cost here, we're not just, as I said, talking about what the national average of flood insurance is, which is usually around $1,000 a year. We're talking about what the overall cost could be to a customer of, as I said, what we've talked about before, being in the wrong flood zone, maybe not knowing what the right flood insurance options are. So maybe you're paying $4,000 a year instead of that $1,000 rate. Now, maybe you've paid an extra $3,000 for the last 3 years. You've got an extra cost of $9,000 simply because somebody didn't know the options. So, but when it comes to the average cost of flood insurance on residential, what we see across the country is an average rate of $1,000. Does that mean your insurance is going to be $1,000? No, could be way less, could be way more, depending on things like replacement cost of the property, how close to water are you, does it flood a lot? You know, all these different factors now the National Flood Insurance Program uses that we'll briefly talk about when we talk about the flood insurance options section of this. Now, when we talk about insurance options, it's very important, and we find that a lot of real estate agents who don't run across it very often don't know, and that is the National Flood Insurance Program is not the only option out there. In fact, in most situations now, it's not even the best option. There's also private flood insurance. Now, what's important to understand is no matter where you go to get a National Flood Insurance Program rate, that rate should be the same. The same is not set for private flood. It could be 30 different options out there in private flood. So if you have a client that's shopping, you always want to make sure they get that National Flood Insurance Program rate, and they get at least 3 different private flood insurance options so they can kind of see what the difference is there. It's one of the reasons when we do a quote for someone, we always provide a National Flood Insurance Program option and a private flood option. You know, they look at risk differently. As I said, the National Flood Insurance Program uses something we call the fingerprint of flood insurance, where they look at distance to water, type of flooding frequency, the replacement cost of a building, elevation of a structure. Private flood looks at these factors and a lot of different things as well when determining their rates. Like a lot of private flood companies won't insure in floodways, but the National Flood Insurance Program does, but it's significantly higher now with their new system. Now let's go back to, you know, when I asked you, hey, maybe this property has a policy already on it. Maybe you can transfer that policy from one buyer to the next. With the National Flood Insurance Program, generally all of these policies are transferable. So what would be some of the benefits of that? Well, let's say that you go and get a rate from the National Flood Insurance Program today. Let's just say it is a $4,000 rate, but the rate on that house right now is about $600. What's going to happen with that National Flood Insurance Program rate? It's going to be at $600, and it's going to have about an 18% rate increase each year until it gets to that $4,000. But it may take you 15 years to get to that $4,000 compared to having to take out that $4,000 policy today. So it could significantly save a buyer. And it could also take a few years to get up there. And when private flood insurance becomes a better option, once they get to a certain threshold, but it may take them several years to do it. So these are called policy assumptions, where they're transferred from one buyer to the next. So if someone tells you, no, you can't do these are always available if it's a National Flood Insurance Program policy, as long as it's generally not a USAA policy, because theirs only apply to USAA members. So just don't want to think about that. Now let's talk a little bit about private flood and the National Flood Insurance Program, what's called risk rating 2.0, wait periods. If you have a loan closing, there's no wait period with either one, private flood or risk rating. Now, it can't just be a real estate closing. It's got to actually be a loan closing to be no wait period. Coverages with the National Flood Insurance Program on residential go up to $250,000 on the building, $100,000 on personal property. Private could go into the millions, actually. It's not uncommon. We just insured a property for right at $1 million in Tennessee compared to the National Flood Insurance Program that didn't offer this. Based on the risk scores, some private flood insurance options may be available, some maybe not. Some things that are available with private that are not with NFIP Risk Rating 2.0 is additional living expenses and replacement costs and contents. Now let's talk about elevation certificates. This is where we have kind of disproven a lot of myths, and that is that elevation certificates are no longer required when it comes to getting flood insurance with the National Flood Insurance Program. Until probably late December 2021, they were required if you were in that special flood hazard area and a property was built, let's just say after 1981. Now you don't have to have them because FEMA is using their own data to kind of analyze a lot of these areas. Now, an elevation certificate could still greatly benefit you. What we always tell people is, look, at the end of the day, an elevation certificate is really where someone put eyes on the property. And to me, putting eyes on that property is going to be much more accurate than FEMA would be with their general data. And so they can still be very beneficial. But what's really great is, say you take out a policy with the National Flood Insurance Program, and 6 months later, you finally get the elevation certificate and it benefits you, they'll go back and prorate that premium from the beginning of the policy. So they can be very beneficial. They're also still beneficial because they're used to do these flood zone changes. Now, with these, as I said, with having an elevation certificate versus not having one, on the private side, they can still help a little bit, but most private companies don't even use them anymore because their data is much more accurate than what FEMA is using. So it can be a huge difference in insurance costs. But, these elevation certificates, I'd say the average cost that we see on them right now across the country, probably around $800. Now, that doesn't mean if you're in a rural area, it's going to be a little bit less, but like in areas of New York, we've seen them where they're $2,500. And so, it's kind of reward versus consequence. And the thing with elevation certificates, you don't really know if they're going to benefit you, unfortunately, until you get them. Now, one way maybe if you've already had a survey done on the property, you could use some numbers off that survey to get a good idea whether it's going to make sense to get one or not. That's what we work with a lot of clients on. Hey, does it make sense for me to get an elevation certificate in this situation? As I said, the cost is, we talked about, could be $800. So there's a miss thing there, but it should be $800 to $1,000 probably. The pricing depends on the state you're in, the area you're in. But other than that, they shouldn't be that much more expensive. As I said, we already talked about the fingerprint of insurance. This is what the National Flood Insurance Program uses to determine some of their rates. So if you have two buildings, replacement costs, they're next door to each other, but one has a much higher replacement cost than the other one, even though they have the same coverages with the National Flood Insurance Program, the one with the replacement cost that's higher could have a significantly higher rate, even though you're not taking out any more coverage. So it's just something to think about. Now, flood loss and flood claims, this is a question we get a lot when people buy properties. They're asking, current property, hey, has the house ever flooded? Two questions we always tell realtors to have their customers ask, no matter what state you're in, because the buyer beware states, property disclosure is, hey, has the property ever flooded since you've owned it or since you've lived in it? And what that does is that protects a buyer if you've had an investor who's never lived there. When you ask those two questions, they have to honestly answer those questions. And so, unfortunately, with flood losses, the only people that can really give you the flood losses, or if they've been paid through the National Flood Insurance Program, the current property owner is the only person that's going to get this. In many situations, they have to call FEMA to get this, but FEMA is also providing this data to them once a year through the mail, through an acknowledgement form, letting them know, hey, this policy, this property had 2 claims in 1978, because these claims will go all the way back to the 70s. So you want to ask the property owner if they have this list or if they can get this list from FEMA, especially as much flooding is happening across the country right now. You want to know if you're buying a property that floods a lot, because it could put you on something called severe repetitive loss list, which means that really the only option for flood insurance is through the National Flood Insurance Program, and it could be significantly higher, and you could be required to do certain mitigation efforts, which could be costly. So it's very important to ask about those losses and to understand where to find them. Now, will private accept properties with flood losses? 70% of the time they will. Usually their condition is it could not have had any losses within the last 5 years. If it's within the last 5 years, many times, most companies, probably 90% of them are not going to take them. There are still a couple that will, but they usually don't have as much coverage available. Their premiums are usually significantly higher. So that's just something to think about. And now we're getting down to the end here. And I appreciate you sitting through this presentation with us. This is our Learning Center here. As I said, if you want to take a picture of the QR code, you can. On this Learning Center, there's no catch here. There's no condition of, hey, you have to provide an email address or anything. This is simply on our website, floodinsuranceguru.com. At the top of the Learning Center, it's filtered by real estate agent, insurance agent, property owner. And basically what we try to do here is answer every possible question for you. You can also visit our YouTube channel, Flood Insurance Guru, where we answer a lot of these, or even tune into our podcast, Flood Insurance Guru, where we answer a lot of these questions as well. On our website too, you'll know something on there that says find out if flood insurance is required. What this is going to do is take you through the flood risk verification. And what this is going to do is when it puts everything on there, it's going to tell you what flood zone you're in. It's going to tell you how far from water you are. What is the estimated premium? What is your flood risk score? What a flood risk score is it's something internally we built from 0 to 100 on what are the real chances of a property flooding. Throw the flood zone out the window. But what is the actual risk of this property? Because that's a lot of property owners want to know. And so that's what you can find there on that on our homepage when you put that information in. And if you're several properties you want to put in there, put them in there. All you got to do is put your name and your email address. And you're probably going to get an email from us just confirming, hey, did you get the information you needed on this flood risk verification? And maybe it's for a listing you've got late at night and you're just trying to get things in there. So that's all I've got. Do we have any questions?
There's not any questions that I know of on there, but I know that you packed in a lot of information here. I want to thank you for spending your time with us today. Make sure you check out his website, floodinsuranceguru.com. Subscribe to the Learning Center. There's a lot of information there. Don't hesitate to reach out to Chris and his team. Make sure that you subscribe, like, and comment on this channel. Chris, again, we really appreciate you spending your time with us to share some of your knowledge with us, because it's just having the real life of every day of what to expect is so important. And like you mentioned earlier, closing that education gap, and you've done a real good job with that. You probably don't realize how much you've the difference that you've made in the industry, because a lot of times trying to find out information is just so hard to try to do, but you've made it easy, you've made it accessible, and you're always willing to share your knowledge. So again, thank you so much for that.
Another thing I ask for too is feedback too. So when people are using that risk tool on our website, hey, if there's more data you want to see, let us know. That's the only way we know that, hey, I really need to see this piece of data on the property. Maybe it's a square footage. Maybe it's a replacement cost, whatever. Let us know so that we can provide you with the right data you want, because we're working on a downloadable form for you as well, where we'll give you basically a report of all that information as well that you can put in your listing if you want.
Exactly. And that's a very important thing of just reach out, give us the information. What about this? Or can you provide this? That will be very helpful. Also, hey, if you all know of any topics that you would like for me to address and have some experts on, let me know, because that's what we're here for. We're here to help fill the gaps that a lot of realtors aren't finding from their brokers and their everyday training on there. We want you to be successful. So, Chris, again, thank you so much for your time. Everyone, I want you to share this information. Be sure to subscribe to Real Estate Power Zone. Be sure to reach out to floodinsuranceguru.com. We can't say it enough. Y'all go out there and get them today.